This week, Cassie Crossley from Schneider Electric is with us to discuss managing complex digital supply chains. Stay tuned for Below the Surface.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 31, being recorded on Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. Well, of course, we're recording the week prior. This is releasing on June 5th. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Alan Alford. Alan, welcome.
Howdy. Thank you, sir.
From the hotel room, you look like you're ready to get in a helicopter with the headset.
I do. I'm feeling good. I'm ready to take off and give the weather report later and the traffic report if we need it as well.
I love it. I love it. It's your travel rig, and but it sounds great. So it's good. Just a quick announcement for our listeners. You can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all that on eclipsium.com/go. Just a couple of other quick announcements, Alan. There's a lot of things that we've published recently at Eclipsium. By the time you're hearing this, my tutorial on using the Bus Pirate 5 for reverse engineering and interfacing with hardware and firmware should be published, which is exciting. I've done a couple of other podcasts that you'll see posted on our socials. Yuri, our one of our founders and CEO, did an amazing interview with the Stack, and just they have an awesome video with like drone footage and Yuri holding up I think a super micro board or something like that. So there's a lot of cool stuff. Make sure you check out our social media channels as we'll be posting those. Lots of cool stuff happening. All righty. And let's see. So we have with us today Cassie Crossley. She's the VP of Supply Chain Security from Schneider Electric with us today. She's an experienced cybersecurity technology executive in information technology and product development, the author of Supply Chain Security, Securing the End-to-End Supply Chain for Software, Firmware, and Hardware. Music to my ears. She has many years of business and technical leadership experience in supply chain security, cybersecurity, product and application security, software firmware development, program management, and data privacy. Cassie, welcome to the show.
Oh, wow. Thanks for having me here, Paul and Alan.
It's great to have you, Cassie. I'd like to start off by just asking you how you get your start in information security.
Oh, let's see. Well, I have to admit, I actually worked back in in the mid 90s at McAfee. So before it was even called cybersecurity, I was in the middle of it back in the day. But I've been in product development and software development for now coming 3.5 decades or so. Started a long time ago as a developer, moved into project and program management in different areas like that. So I've been in and around the software development part of it and worked on some products, especially I started at Schneider almost 14 years ago, and I was a PMO director for the video line of business. So we had a lot of products, cameras, DVRs, that kind of thing for commercial. And we had a lot of products that had firmware, hardware, all of that. So that's when I really moved into the realm of not only doing the software, but also the hardware side. So from a information security standpoint, I moved into the CISO office about 8 years ago, focused a lot on the governance and compliance aspects, moved over to the product security office about 4.5 years ago. 5 years ago, where I led all the secure development lifecycle and all the training and awareness and everything for R&D, which is 14,000 folks around the world. So heavily involved with our thousands of products and product security. So that's
awesome.
That's where I've got it all.
And there's a tie back here to Rhode Island, which I think is really funny. So I live in Rhode Island, and the studio here is in Warwick, Rhode Island, which isn't too far from, well, nothing's that
Right.
far in Rhode Island, right? But
Yeah.
APC was like a staple technology company in Rhode Island for as long as
Yes.
I can remember. Right? And a lot of my peers and friends that work in technology in Rhode Island worked at one point at APC.
That's
And
right.
APC was acquired by Schneider Electric. You probably know the can get the date
Yeah, it
closer
was
than I.
probably maybe 18 years ago now. I mean, quite a long time, but we still keep the APC brand.
Right.
We call that division in that line of business Secure Power, but we still have large UPSs. We have desktop level UPSs. So our Secure Power and APC lines and brands are just a fantastic product. I work with those teams. I actually led the ERP migration for that entire
Mm,
business unit, which is
mhm.
how I ended up with a 401 area code for my work.
There you go.
Because back then they couldn't even dial my California phone number, so
Right,
I
right.
got a local number for
Yeah,
them.
it was
But yeah,
before,
I have a
yeah.
lot of folks that I know and still work a lot with the APC, and they actually had people in Ireland, so I led this whole
Right,
program.
yeah.
So it was a lot of Rhode Island, Ireland, and India
Oh, that's too
for
cool.
that project.
Yeah, and a lot of, and you mentioned it, Cassie, there's, desktop UPSs and probably some floating around here in the studio, right? I have some at home because I always buy APC because a local company, right?
Right,
But you get
right.
into the server side, and I believe a lot of the applications, for the larger data centers are remotely turning off, power. So they're network connected, they have firmware that
Yes.
you interact with and in a software
Yeah.
stack.
Yes. And of course, for those, especially the three-phase UPSs, we do so much data center work. We've got lots of rack units that are all in those different systems. So all sorts of different product lines for that.
Yeah, you've got a lot of products to
Yes.
keep tabs on the supply chain. I think we were talking about that, earlier.
Right.
It's just the sheer
Yeah.
number of products that have hardware, software, firmware, and I like how you called out, each 3 individually, but there's just that's a ton of, you think about the supply chain for any piece of electronics. In Schneider Electric, you're producing several different product lines.
That's right. We've done the analysis. It looks like we've got hundreds of thousands of SKUs. But when you think some of those are cables and
Sure.
just other non-intelligent components, but 15,000 intelligent SKUs.
Wow.
So many of those can be of a same family. You could have the same firmware across multiple lines. You could
Mhm.
have the same product running different pieces. So I can have multiple SBOMs, software bills of materials for a single product, or a single SBOM that goes to multiple products. It's a very interesting kind of way to have to connect everything up along with the HBOMs, the hardware bills of material. So I'm dealing with all of that from a supply chain standpoint. Schneider Electric, we have 54,000 suppliers total,
Wow.
and when you look at the ones that provide intelligent components, whether it be software, chips, integrated components, intelligent components, or even manufacturing systems like those that do manufacturing work for those are about 2,000 plus suppliers. And those are the ones that I concentrate
Mhm.
a lot on the supply chain security. And so we have a very robust third party assessment process
Mhm.
specifically for those, because all of those suppliers, just like Schneider Electric being a supplier, there's supply chain risk, right? So there's more in depth analysis, and we actually do an evidence based review that's specifically geared to that. So for our manufacturing equipment system suppliers, so those that may be touching the components or flashing,
Mhm.
PCBAs or printed circuit boards, we ask different questions of that. We find out about their infrastructure security controls. We find out about who is accessing that. We find out, whether or not they, is everything set for admin. We ask a lot of questions
Mhm.
that you normally wouldn't know to ask in those manufacturing systems. But same with suppliers. I mean, we have suppliers that are building, we buy commercial software from right? That we
Mhm.
include in it. It's not all open source. A lot of people, just like us, we use open source, but we have commercial libraries and components, and we have to ask a lot of in-depth questions and ask about their secure development lifecycle or if they have one. And so we're really, really pushing the industry to improve their security and uplift their security practices.
It seems like you have like a great handle on it all. No, Cassie, how do you manage and track like that many suppliers and different types of systems?
Well, I think that first off, any kind of mature supplier has a supplier management system. We're no different
Mhm.
than that.
Okay.
But what's been different is, especially over the last 6 years or so, is integrating the cyber aspect of that into supplier risk management.
Mhm.
Because supplier risk management, you use you check the financials, you check let's just see, who they buy from, who are their upstreams if it's more of a hardware side, but you didn't ask all the cyber questions. And honestly, when I looked at the cyber questions that we used to ask, they were pretty, basic
Mhm.
from that standpoint. You would ask it, but it was not really an indicator. And really nowadays we know that even somebody with a very robust cybersecurity program, let's say a Microsoft, things happen. So
Right.
it's also a lot about the resiliency and their vulnerability management practices. And that is something that we really stress and work for. So when I'm signing a cybersecurity agreement with a supplier, that I have mature suppliers who redlined some of the vulnerability information. I need an SLA. I need a service level agreement on when you're going to fix a vulnerability.
Mhm.
And when they redline that, I'm like, well, what do you have? Put in what your process is so we can, validate it against us. And some of the mature suppliers didn't even have that yet. So
Mm.
it takes a lot of time. It's a lot of conversations. So when you're talking about the supplier risk, we categorize just like most people do, your suppliers, critical, high, medium. And one thing to keep in mind is that not all critical suppliers is somebody you spend a lot of money with. So for example, while a lot of our products may use a Linux embedded system, some of our products use commercial real-time operating systems or
Mhm.
real-time RTOS, right? But our service agreements with them may not be that much that we have to spend that year, but yet they're a critical supplier.
Right.
So if we use that real-time operating system in 100 products and they have a vulnerability, that becomes like a KEV or, a known exploitable vulnerability, then I need to know much more about their processes and practices. And so we've set up what we call these cyber leader connects, where I know the leadership and they know me at our key suppliers. So
Mhm.
just like in the current days where you have quality people talking with manufacturers, now you have product security leaders like myself that are talking directly with those suppliers and making sure that we're on the same path. And that sometimes means that there's programs set in place for early disclosure, under
Mhm.
certain agreements, things like that, because there's such a dependency.
I can
So
tell you've
it's
been
it's
thinking
definitely
about
not
this for a
easy.
long time, Cassie, just the
Yeah,
the various aspects that you've gone into. And one I wanna harp on is
yeah,
it's not about, like, how much money we spend with
no,
a particular vendor or supplier. It's the criticality of various components, a
right,
particular component to the business. And,
right,
in my for example, in my, blog post that's, coming out, I talk about a SPY flash chip. Those are
yeah,
very, very inexpensive components, right? I mean, if you at scale, right, you start getting
right,
below 50 cents, right, for
yes,
different chips. But if that's critical to the business, to the functioning of that overall system, then
yes.
you have to put the same scrutiny as a vendor or supplier you're spending millions of dollars with.
Right, right. And that's the same with open source, right? We're not
Mm-hmm.
spending anything
Mm.
on that. Yet
Mhm.
if I'm using, I mean, we saw it with Log4j and other, types of components. We didn't have XZ, but if you've got OpenSSL or any of the others, you need to know that, and that information about where used. And that's why I've been such, a key player in the SBOM world and collecting these. We have thousands. I have since January of 21. I've been requiring SBOMs for all of our products that we've released. And so we're leveraging them that way to be able to say when something happens, where used. And so knowing the provenance and knowing what's in our products is really, really important, because you can't put a dollar number on it, because it's more about that impact, just like what you're
Yeah.
saying with that chip.
But at SBOMs, I think for open source are gaining traction and extremely useful, where
Yeah.
I think the challenge is, I'd like to get your take on it. How do we use SBOMs from commercial software? Or is just the
Yeah.
SBOM knowing the because inside commercial software, if there's no open source components, what's the SBOM going to say? I
Right.
I
How do you
wrote
Right.
how do you get
something
them to
completely
reveal?
proprietary. Yeah, I wrote
Yeah.
something
Right.
completely proprietary, but it's not a open SSL, right? It's
Right.
whatever I wrote. What's the SBOM for?
Well, I'm still waiting for some SBOMs for .NET.
Yep.
So, it's going to take some time. I think that, now, some vendors have really started to release that information and realize it. There are other vendors that, do some level of reverse engineering, which is helpful. There are, so when we have some commercial libraries, we actually have the source code itself. So we're
Yeah,
able
yeah, totally.
to
Yep.
analyze it. And we're actually working with some of our vendors that do binary scans to
Mhm.
be able to, for us to be able to create a footprint to just identify what's in them, but understand the transitive dependencies is really, going to take a lot of time. So for example, I have an older product that's still used, but let's just say it's legacy, and also from a generation standpoint where you don't use package libraries. So it's back in
Yeah.
the day when the commercial libraries, you had all the source code and compiled it together, and that product is still in use, and it's a good product. But when you do a binary scan on it, it didn't reveal, that the SBOM quality was, I would say,
Mhm.
15%. I see SBOM
Right.
qualities, they range from about 15% to about 85. There's lots of, that 15% is where it can't identify to me, the right version level. It won't identify backported patches, things like that. So
Mhm.
no SBOM is ever coming out perfect. But for those older legacy applications, the teams are having to go through and identify that, and it is missing a lot of transitive dependencies. But I've been working on a project with the U.S. Department of Defense and some other companies where we're going into and going deeper and deeper into these transitive dependencies to be able to look for the risks. So it's as definitely from your company, there's a long way to go in this,
Yeah,
and that
for sure.
visibility and transparency is really important to Schneider Electric. So we're doing what we can. It's not perfect.
Mhm.
It's got a long way to go, but you know we're farther along than we were even 2 years ago.
Yeah. You mentioned legacy products, and Alan, I
Yeah.
had some questions about end of life, which I think is a great
Yeah.
topic.
So, we're having the whole conversation about the antique code, if you will, and even
Yeah.
before these open source compiled without packages and antique code, we rolled our own, and it was
Yes.
object oriented, or God forbid procedural, depends on how far back we go.
Right.
Um, you know, you get to a point where everybody has this "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" mindset,
Mm.
and I'm curious, how do you get across to suppliers, and how do you get across to consumers even, if it's not patched for security, it's broke because it's still working, and everyone seems to be,
Right.
the parts are flowing down the assembly line. No one else is complaining, and here you are trying to, how do you convince them? What do you do there?
Well, first off, a lot of what we build is either OT or industrial IoT or IoT that should not be uh, external internet facing. So
Hmm.
we don't build, we're not a Cisco. A lot of our products should be behind and properly follow defense in depth controls within that environment. especially if they're used in critical infrastructure and, or even data centers or anything like that. So it's an interesting question because for our firmware PKIs, for those certificates, we actually create 30-year certificates. I know of one vendor that does 40-year certificates, but yet we know that those products don't, the end of life is long before
Mhm.
30 years, but it could be 10 to 15 years, right? And so this end of life is a big discussion, and it's kind of coming much to the forefront with the new European Union Cyber Resilience Act, CRA,
Hmm.
because they're going to be requiring at time of release to acknowledge when the end of life cycle is. Now, for products like ours, which are intended to, be 10, 15 years, that's not unusual. They're trying to prevent the 2 to 3 years. But to your point, this conversation, especially when I started as a developer, by the way, there's code of mine still on your systems, right? If you've got a Windows computer, I wrote lines of code for paint.exe
Mhm.
and not the 3D version, but the original version, and it's still on your system, right? So code lasts for decades,
Hmm.
and we're going to expect to see that. Now, that code doesn't, there's no login, there's no this, there's no that. So from a logic standpoint, really, it's not something that you need to be concerned of. So I think what we're doing, especially in our threat modeling right now, and also, as I said, in that transparency project, is identifying, these are the pieces of the components that are logic facing or have an external facing attack surface, or, all of these different kinds of things. And so we're prioritizing those from a path standpoint and where we need to be really focused on. Because when you're looking at an OT product, I think even when the California Connected Device Law came out about IoT, we took it very seriously. But the first question we got from everybody is, this is not meant internally. This is not meant to be an internet facing product. It's got a serial cable, but it's still, if there's, lateral movement or things like that, things can happen to it. So it is not an easy conversation. We have so many of these conversations when we
Hmm.
go to our threat modeling and our security reviews and going through that. So from an end of life standpoint, one of the things that with the CRA and other things is really how more of a decommissioning or a longevity kind of security piece in the hardening document. So ignore CISA as wanting to call it a loosening document, but if you were having to keep this past end of life, and I know, everybody's got end of life products out there, is, what are you doing to secure that? I don't think that you have to rip and replace everything if you've got the right controls in place, right?
Right.
Yeah, and
You
that
can
but that's
put a
refreshing to hear, and I believe the
yeah,
legislation and certainly some of the frustration at,
yeah,
covering this industry for 20 years is the the majority of the problem that I think the legislation addresses is
yeah,
the IoT vendors that are making Wi-Fi routers, right? I won't
right,
name them specifically. We all know the brands that are out there, and we can all read the vulnerability and exploit feeds and go, well, there's a vulnerability. Someone published an exploit, and XYZ manufacturer goes, that product's end of life, and there's no more
right,
firmware or software updates for it, and so you have to buy a new one. And I
right,
think that's where the legislation comes in. It's like, whoa, we have to find some middle ground here. Like, I understand, I hope they understand that when you make a product, eventually you have to stop support. We can't support things forever,
right,
right?
right.
But from the consumer side, we can't expect the consumers in this case replace their devices every couple of years. Like, that's just not,
Well,
to
but
me, I feel
if you
that's unfair.
knew but if you knew when you bought it, so I'm not going to use a car example for a moment, but let's just say you bought a consumer router, or even your phone, and it says we will only support this for 5 years, and you knew it when you bought it,
Hmm.
and yet somebody else sells one for $500 more, but they'll support it for 10 years. Which one are you most
Yeah.
likely willing to buy? That's the kind of conversation and decisions that we don't give right now the consumers
Hmm.
Hmm.
an answer to. And that's what like the EU CRA will help with. And that's becoming a big deal for cars too, right? So certain components of cars, and I've worked with several folks in the connected vehicles industry just in discussion for product security and how do we maintain all of this and that certificates, and just everything else from that is what happens with the vendor if one of your suppliers goes under and
You're stuck
and
with that
they're a
support,
critical
right?
component for that. And so we're having a lot of these discussions about, both in the contract, but how do you do this resilience part of it? But if I know that I would have to spend 20 grand more to pay for a car that has a 20-year lifespan
Mhm.
versus one that has a 10, then I'm going to do that. So we're going to start to see those. You don't see it today, but in the next 2 to 3 years, I think that that'll be a big decision factor
Yeah.
is this level of end of life. And there's actually an open EOX project right now going on and about how do you provide this not only just on a tech sheet, but how do you make updates to that? Because when you're looking, let's just say, for example, you've promised to go a minimum of 10 years on a product and you choose to go 15 years. But if you want that extra 5 years, you have to pay a service level agreement for it
Mhm.
because how are we going to continue to support? I mean, our R&D teams, right?
Right. And
There's
but
going to be some
leasing
level.
plays into it, and it speaks to your car example. I think
Yes.
it's one reason why I have a Tesla, and I leased my Tesla. 'Cause I'm like,
Right.
"Look, this is basically a battery and a computer on wheels." Like,
Exactly.
it needs to go somewhere else that I don't have to worry about it, after I lease it,
That's right.
after my lease expires. Now, we've done
Yes.
this in IT. We also
Yes.
lease equipment in IT, which I think is smart,
Yes.
but you can't really do that with everything, right? Because
No.
when your
No.
lease comes up, you have decisions. Am I gonna have to rip and replace it
Yes.
or purchase it after the lease, in which case I'm in the same boat as if I had bought it from a cybersecurity
Right.
perspective.
Right. But that's coming I mean, even in critical infrastructure, a lot of products now, things are going into more of that service maintenance
Mhm.
where it's built into the cost, that
Hmm.
refresh. And honestly, it's a lot easier to manage that than maintain for a significantly, long period of time some of that older architecture. I mean, there's products out there, in the firmware, one of ours, I don't even know which one it is, only had 4 bytes left. There's only
Yeah.
so much upgrades that you
You can
can
do.
do
Yeah.
for older architecture.
Yeah. No, I agree. And some of that gear, it does what it does. It's different from a car or a laptop or a phone, which
Yeah,
after a certain period of time, like I'm new technology is going to come out. I'm going to need something new,
right.
right? But there's like AV gear as an example. Um, I've got an HDMI router switcher thing. Like it
Mhm.
does HDMI routing and switching. What more does it need to
Right.
do? And it's going to function. If it functions forever, it functions forever. But
Yeah.
the end of life happens, and if there's a vulnerability, I'm out of luck.
Right. Right. Or you at least should know and are notified to be able to say, "How do I manage this? What else
Mm,
can I do to control and just let it continue on?"
right.
Yeah.
Alan, do you have more questions on end of life?
Yeah, I'm thinking of other examples. You mentioned AV, Paul, and I used to be in the video conferencing industry, and what we found was our customers would continue to use our gear, 5,
Hmm.
10 years past what we ever thought they would.
Right.
And you're seeing the same thing. You guys build reliable stuff. Like your brand is known
Absolutely.
for reliability, and there you are, OT. But you've got governments, and you've got city infrastructures, and you've got waterworks, and you've got all these various entities that don't have flexibility of budget. How many times are they coming to you and saying, we don't really have a choice, we're stuck continuing to use your gear until it literally implodes, which may be 10 more years still, right?
Right.
how do you
Right.
how do you contend with those stories? Do you negotiate? Do you, like, because you want to secure them, and yet they want to keep using the really really old stuff? What do you do?
Right. And that's where, some modernization services are now where they fit into the ops budget instead of requiring capital improvement budget. So, like today, some people, they'll do the 20-year lease on solar panels for their house because they don't want to do the, 3-year upfront to pay for it. But then you're locked in to some level of of commitment to that group. And so that's happening in some places with modernization, where being able to change out as long as you're building it into the ops budget, and that ops budget, operational budget is going to increase every year. It's going to
Mhm.
just expand at some level, because it's different than just, it used to be I could buy, this one. I didn't need a sensor on this kind of thing because I had a person that was watching it. But now I don't have that person anymore. So I want a sensor to do it. So there are a lot of programs out there doing that. There's actually quite a number of government programs that have been introduced with the infrastructure bills and different kinds of things to help modernize and pay for those. But I just want to acknowledge that we've got so many, let's just say, company products out there over the lifetime. I mean, people are using washer and dryers that are 30 years old, right?
Mhm.
Right.
But I know when I buy a washer and dryer now, I'm trying to avoid as much. I don't want it to be Bluetooth connected and this
Right.
and that and be able to set up because I know personally what it takes to maintain it. So I think there's going to be more of a balance about how, where we're going to do our investments. I think some people are actually, still considering how do we maintain some analog features in all of this for resiliency. But I think we're still pretty far along on, how do we digitize everything to this point? So, all I can suggest for those folks is, I mean, if you're again looking at it from a Purdue model or defense in depth or anything of that, like work outside in, focus and prioritize your spending on those that are definitely external facing. So, we've got products that we know are not supposed to be external internet facing, yet we see them in internet searches and
Yeah.
such. And so we have a program where we contact our install base, try to reach out to them. And for those that we can't figure out who they are, we've been working with government agencies so that they can help identify and notify those vendors, those groups. So
That's
you shouldn't
huge.
have, for example, this, specific, let's just say, device out external facing. I mean, we saw it and we're going to see more of that. And so this is something that the US government CISA is working. We brought this to CISA, but now CISA's discussing this with some other vendors, manufacturers about these let's just say these more unusual protocols,
Mhm.
because
Yeah,
we've
and
got
I agree, Cass, because a lot of times
yeah,
I'll read the security research that's coming out in any given week, and I'll start reading how they got into the device and analyze the security. I'm like, well, this thing should never be on the internet. And
exactly,
sometimes I have to look and see what it does. I'm like, you analyze the security of this device. I don't know what that device is, and I go look at it. I'm like,
right,
oh, as a specific use case. I'm like, that doesn't need to be on the internet. And
right.
then lo and behold, you read further in the report, and like, oh, we went to Shodan and we found 10,000 of them on the internet or
That's right,
some
It's
number
always
like, and this
that's
Shodan.
right,
happens over and over and over
right,
again. And I think we have two solutions that we kind of hinted on. One is government programs to increase our cyber resiliency to get this
yeah,
stuff replaced. I think the FDA
yes,
has some things in the works, right, to help have funding to actually replace devices when
hmm
it comes to health and safety, right?
right,
And the other thing is what you're doing, which is amazing, is from the manufacturer side, helping your customers. I mean, they're your customers, right? And if it's not
right,
configured correctly, like how great is that from a vendor to go, hey, we found this, like maybe you didn't know it was exposed to the internet, and like here's
right.
a guide, a best practice guide, and a reminder, like take it off the internet. I think that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we definitely support and really, the proper segmentation, proper, separation. There is still lateral movement. Some of these things have very, let's just say, protocols. I mean, there's products out there that have to be backwards compatible and
Hmm.
interoperability with TLS 1.0 and HTTP because other components in that same, let's say, electrical station, substation, or water,
Hmm.
facility, they're still operating on insecure protocols. But you can put in proper, hardware components, software
Yeah.
components, all of that in there to be able to encrypt that. And so a lot of those technologies, and I saw, several great ones at RSA, and, we, along with other companies like yourself, I mean, that's where we're really going to be able to enhance and improve the existing infrastructure that's out there, because there's only a few percentage points that you can update every year.
Yeah, it's easy for us, I think, as to cybersecurity professionals to go, well, you shouldn't use insecure protocols. But I think all of us have probably been in a situation where it's mission critical to the business. It was
Right.
me at the university. Mission critical. It's how data
Yes.
goes from here to there, and how students register, right? Or
Right.
get their financial aid, and you
Yes.
can't disrupt that. So you need workarounds until you can
Right.
build a solution. But there could be a lot of dependencies in that, where you're not just
Yep.
rebuilding one thing; you rebuild a lot of other things in order to get rid
Yes.
of that insecure protocol. I've been there.
Right. Yeah, and same with hospitals. I
Yeah.
mean, with all of those different
Hmm.
devices that they have in different systems. I mean, it's just as complicated as any other kind of infrastructure, if not more so, because they have to certify to a certain level, and when you change that infrastructure, then they have to get reapprovals.
Right.
So it's even harder,
Right.
to be
Right.
secure.
And the authentication to the device is always suspect. And this has been
Mhm.
a reoccurring theme every time I look at any kind of, we used to call them embedded systems, now it's IoT
Yes.
devices. And the authentication for administration of that device oftentimes is what leads to some kind of security failure. And it was Ed
Right.
Scotus, I think, years ago on one of my podcasts, was like, if we could come up with a more standard way to authenticate to these devices, and there have been several attempts since then in standard frameworks to enhance the
Hmm.
authentication. But I want to get into multi-factor and passwordless as well. But just before we get to that, how do you manage authentication to these devices, especially now legislation is requiring better authentication?
Yeah, so this is quite a bit of a debate between the OT vendors and the IT side of the house, and those in government who think everything is a mobile app or a cloud app.
Mm,
Um, so from an even an IoT or OT standpoint, if you boot up your Apple phone for the first time, there's essential protocols that it goes through to be able to you set it up. But when you get that phone, for example, the iPhone, it has 50 apps, 49 real apps in the operating system. So you have all of these different things that could have happened to it. So I am, really, when it comes to the uh, on first use kind of access, that's a bit of debate that we went in through, even when the California law said on first use.
Hmm.
Because let me give you an example. For a control panel. So let's say you have a control panel that's going into a building, and it is set up, what we call engineering to order. So it's built specifically for that environment, and it's got some firmware and different components in it. We ship it to an installer. They do some configuration and setups between all of it, and then it's turned over to somebody in facility management. Now, that facility management, let's just say Bob is working there. It's not shouldn't be MFA'd to him, right? I mean, this is a control panel, a smart panel that's part of a building system. So who really is the user of this,
right.
that should be tied into it.
The user is like
And
now the
so
fourth level, right? You got manufacturer, integrator, then the
exactly.
local, probably works for the company, facilities management, but then the end
Right.
users controlling the building is someone probably different, right?
Right, right. And that person could be somebody different the next day, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't,
Mm.
these aren't personal devices
Mm-hmm.
and or personal access because I'm logging into this SaaS platform, or I'm an admin. And that's one of the things that, I mean, imagine you're renting a car, same kind of thing. You don't have any personal identity to that. So, I believe that there's a lot of work that is being done both at the IT level for zero trust and then just over in general on the OT side. It is a complicated area because you have this. Let's just say this longevity again,
Mhm.
from a standpoint of who is the true user and owner and who has access to it. So that's where you really get into this concept of more of a zero trust. Now, you can do a lot of that. A lot of our products, of course, are Active Directory and LDAP and,
Mhm.
those kinds of platforms. But you've got to have those set right. When I see documents from CISA, and they've gotten my more than 2 cents worth.
Mhm.
They know me by name, and they talk about MFA and they use that as a talking point. I'm like, I have an HMI. I have a 9 keypad digital thing on a safety device. It doesn't follow password,
Mhm.
40 character. It is, they need to get access to it to be able to monitor, levels of critical chemicals, and so there's certain passcodes and things like that. So there's a lot of edge use cases, which to us are not edge cases. This is our everyday life in the
Right.
OT world, that are not yet solvable at a single, we all must do it this way. So from a passwordless standpoint, that's where, especially from an OT side, where the zero trust and, let's just look at, proper execution of, least privilege. How is that developed in the systems? How is that figured out from a service layer standpoint? Because when you've got run commands on OT devices, it could do different kinds of things, right? You've got, reading of data
Mhm.
versus actual execution on an operational technology. So there's different levels that could be done at, but you're not going to again label them to Bob or Jim or Sally or anything like that. And that's where I think those of us in the ICS and OT industry really are at conflict with a lot of these new IT rules and regulations. And so we are part of a OT cyber coalition that is working with a lot of our peer companies in the same industries, but also those that support those kind of platforms like Eclipsium, that understand that OT mindset and how you manage and secure it is a completely different
Mhm.
environment. And even with, I was just reading something from the U.S. Defense Industrial Base, and they put out about their cybersecurity strategy, and it didn't mention OT at all.
Mhm.
I mean, and really, when the National White House, we did a read in, and it didn't mention OT, and they're like, "Well, we're really concentrating on IT and consumer." I'm like, "Well, you know, that's not critical infrastructure. There's a lot of critical infrastructure that needs to be done." So
Right.
there's
But it
there's
explains
many of
why how
us.
it
Yeah.
explains a lot of times how we end up with default passwords and
Yes.
uh I don't want to say backdoor passwords, but the
Right.
default that's baked in that you can't change is
Yes.
different from the default. It explains a lot. It's serviceability, maintainability,
Yes.
because we don't know
Absolutely.
who's going to be touching it, who's going to need to go in and fix something if there's an
Right.
emergency. And that's how
Yes.
in consumer products, in all different products, we and my HVAC system at home is
Yeah.
not internet connected, and I'm kind
Yeah.
of torn because part of me wants it to be connected to the internet so I can get diagnostics like over the network,
Right.
right? But the other part of me sees the problems with that, and I'm like, I'm kind of glad it's not. In the to get into the admin screens on this tiny little LCD panel, it's got to be three
Yes.
by three. The
Right.
default code is 5309 from the song.
Yeah.
And that's how I remember it. But again, if a
Right.
technician comes out, like, obviously I'm in a homeowner situation. I'm there. If I don't
Right.
think I can change that code either. But
Yeah.
again, it's not an internet connected device. But for manageability, serviceability, that's how we end up in these
Yes.
situations.
Right. Yeah, the serviceability is a large aspect of it. And the fact that you've got multiple, different products together as one system. And so how are you going to remember that this one is,
Hmm.
you reset it this way and this one you reset this way. So a lot of these environments, when they're building them,
Hmm.
and this is one of the other reasons why there's a lot of legacy architecture, it's they want that homogeneous environment.
Mm.
They want I know how to fix this one. It's like when somebody does a fleet of cars, you don't buy, Toyotas and Fords and this and that. You buy all the same, because then you know can have a service parts inventory, you know how to maintain it, and if something goes down, you can swap it out easily.
Yeah, and, I saw this too at a university, and until we had a better system, I actually set up a AAA, authentication and authorization system, back in the day, but before that, there was a lot of default passwords that were, like, our own,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
we sat down as a group, and we were like, "Okay, we're getting ready to do this next big upgrade, we're gonna get rid of all that stuff," and it was a lot of work to identify the
Yeah.
older stuff and get rid of those, and again, this was our own doing, this didn't come from the vendor, the integrator, the
Right.
manufacturer. This was our own doing. We had to
Yes.
undo our own basically default passwords, the ones
Yeah.
that we said, well, if you go to a device and it's, you're doing maintenance on it, this is how you get into it, right? So we had to change
Right.
that.
And that's that part of it is, if even if you're just changing API tokens, right?
Mhm.
Or something of that, where are you storing it all? Who has access to all of that? But I get contracts that say, we need automated key management. Well, if this component is in the middle of a forest that has no interconnectivity, how do you do,
Mhm.
automatic and external key management if it's not intended to? So we have that just overall as an industry. There are solutions, but is that something that somebody pays money for? I mean,
Mhm.
it's a pain in the butt, but you just get along with it. Okay, we're just going to use KeyPass or something. I mean,
Mhm.
there's all sorts of different ways that people are managing all of these different tokens and keys and
Yeah, Alan, I think you have some
passwords.
questions surrounding the
Yeah.
PKI.
Yeah, I've got about 10,000 questions, honestly. I mean,
Oh,
I guess my first observation is, from the get go, the priority for the outer world seems to be IT, IoT, OT. Like you guys are the redheaded stepchildren. No one ever thinks through
yep.
what you're doing.
Yeah.
We've already talked about defense in depth. We're talking about interconnected systems where you've got a central console that has 20 different serial cables going to 20 identical devices, and it's all over serial ports. And you don't want 20 separate passwords, so
No.
it's password reuse almost by need, right? But
Mhm.
not in the conventional way we think of when we think of password reuse. It's more like device over device, which means we're really saying default password. But you get into the whole, to your point, it's out in the woods. What do you do? Who's
Yep.
going to access it? You now have a chain of custody almost, for lack of a
That's
better
right.
term. Your integrator who's set up may not be the integrator who's around 10 years from now when the first
Mhm.
boo boo happens. So if you took
Right.
all the time to
Right.
password list them and
And
get
it's
them set
written
up,
in pen on
yes,
the
On the device.
on a
Yeah.
piece of paper.
Mhm.
right.
Yes.
So I just, your journey to passwordless sounds like an almost impossible journey. I mean, I guess that's what I'm getting at. Is that, I mean,
Mhm.
where we all talk about let's get past MFA and let's get past all this, but passwordless, you're still storing and automating all manner of tokens, certs, whatever it might be, right?
Right, right.
How are you guys
Now,
going
I
to
mean,
possibly tackle that? I mean, at some point, it almost feels like you just got to push back on everyone around you and say, "This is the OT world. Get over it." I mean, what's the solution here?
no, first off, I'm not a cybersecurity architect. I work with lots of them. So, we're doing a lot with um, just different kinds of concepts. I mean, working through that one problem of how does an integrator do it to be able to meet the letter of the law, but also be able to be customer friendly. There's ways to do it, and we all know that there's ways to reset. My home router right here. Uh, uh, to put it to a default configuration.
Hmm.
There's with the different kinds of ways now to be able to reset not to factory default, but to
Mhm.
configuration to standard configuration. So we're looking at, we've got different ways depending on the kind of product to say, this will get you to this level, to the raw, bare bones, framework. Here's to get to this slice of configuration. So we do have ways with the products to be able to get it to a state so it is, uh, baseline images
Yeah.
at that level. And we have to do that partially also because when you think about the service model, right? When you actually have to send a device over, there's ways that you have to clear certain data anyway from a data risk standpoint, right? You don't want the
Hmm.
sensor data and all of that to be in there. So you need to be able to take it in hopefully to a level that has at least just here's the configuration piece to be able to do whatever maintenance. So there, the architecture is being able to support that at different levels in the newer architecture, but it does take time, and it adds complexity
Mm-hmm.
to the overall configuration and setup of where you want to set to what state do you want it to go back to.
So I guess what we're getting back to, and this is kicking it old school, but it's a valid principle that's been around since the dawn of time. Physical access is access, right? Like I've got my device configured to talk to these other 20 things that are controlling very sensitive things. Don't alter that config, but if I've got physical access to it, I can tweak the login config and get back to basic login so that I can get in to do the whatever I'm doing.
Yes.
So that's, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a smart play. It's and
Well,
that also ties to your defense in depth and everything
right.
else we've talked about.
And there can be, I mean, there is there is someone that I was talking to. There's a technology where they're able to store 30 years of keys, like one use sets of keys, and in
Mm-hmm.
a very small footprint. So being able to say, okay, I have this, I'm using it, and then it throws, it's out the door. I can't ever use that one again. And so things like that are technology and things that we're working towards, and that there's other um, uh, architectures to consider
Yeah.
that will be able to go past that. So you have, the private key, stored, but so for example, let's just say Xfinity wants to get to my router and I haven't reset it. They can use this one-time key, and it's stored like, a million different permutations, and it could do it. There's lots of ways that are coming to, but again, it's not something that's going to last 100 years, because my question
Right.
is, what happens in year 31?
Yeah.
Well, that's if you use one a day and so on and so forth. And so those are the kinds of considerations and different discussions that we're having.
There's some very clever solutions at play here. This
Could
is much
be,
more
yeah, yeah.
nuanced than what I was expecting it to be. That's really cool.
And that person that I was talking to is having to figure it out for things like naval submarines that are not connected, right? So again, back to this disconnected environment, where, how do you bring these technologies, especially for air gap systems or systems that don't have this level of connectability, and still need that level of security
Mm-hmm.
when there is an access that's needed to be able to do updates and firmware changes.
I want to go back to SBOM for a
Okay.
moment, Cassie. And so, from Schneider Electric perspective, you're very kind of bullish on SBOMs, that your products have SBOMs. Is that true? And what tips
Yes.
do you have for
Yes.
people to get to that point? Because I feel like when we spoke earlier, you were very advanced in going, yeah, we have an SBOM.
Yeah. Well, first off, we don't force our teams to do it in exact same way.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got some teams where we're building the SBOMs off binaries, which means they give me their binaries, and I have a team that generates them.
Mm-hmm.
So because these are old build pipelines, I mean,
Yep.
really
Yep.
old.
Yeah.
They're not even a pipeline;
Mm-hmm.
it's a build
It's a
script.
build. Yeah, it's a
And
script.
then,
Yeah.
yeah, and then there's teams that are very advanced and they use Yocto or they use .NET projects and things like that. And I'm like, if you can produce an SBOM, and by the way, I don't require them to be Cyclone DX or SPDX. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
whatever you can generate, even if it's a CSV file, or whatever. But a JSON Cyclone DX, that'd be the preferred method. But if not, we'll take whatever, and then we take them for storage, so that we have an actual platform that we use, a technology solution from a vendor, that even if I had imported it as a Cyclone DX, the customer can download it as an SPDX. So that's really
Oh,
nice.
okay. Oh, that's cool. So you have a
Mm-hmm.
That
customer, yeah. So you can, because some of the concern with SBOM is if I make them all public, then there's
Yeah,
ramifications to that, right? But you have
no,
systems in place where customers can access the
that's
the
right.
SBOM, which is really the
Yes.
the requirement, right?
Yes, and I'm working with some asset management companies to be able to potentially have my repository of SBOMs and the metadata for it. So, because it isn't that SOC analyst really cares, to look through all of the SBOMs that Schneider has for Log4j. They
Hmm.
want to know, which products, is it this product that may have a log4j? That's what they care about.
Mhm.
So if I'm able to get that metadata over to an asset management company like a ServiceNow or a Clarity or Nozomi or anybody, and be able to say, this does have that information in it. And so they should be aware of it. And then they can generate and use it for risk analysis. That's really what people want to use it for, right?
Right.
They don't really care which version of Log4j is. They care whether or not are they potentially at risk. So, but that didn't answer the earlier question, but that's where I'm headed to. So I'm
Mhm.
really pushing the industry. I'm going, Dr. Alan Freeman was like, I'm here and everybody else, they're in the crawl, but I'm always working. I'm at the run stage trying to get there from a scaling standpoint. So that's my next journey. But that journey to get all of those SBOMs and the teams is by allowing them. I have somebody that we work with. They are figuring out, okay, based off of my build pipeline, this is what I can generate. Hey, that's great. I'm not going to be dictating you must do it this way and this way and this way. The end result, if you can create the output so that I can meet that requirement to provide it to
Mhm.
customers and for us to use it, we use it all the time in our cert. So our
Right.
cert has access to all of these things, and that way they know. And again, it's not going to have all the transitive dependencies, so there's still going to be gaps. But if they know that they've got to talk to these 12 teams to say what, we need to put out an alert, a security bulletin, then let's do that. So when Log4j came out, we already had a collection of SBOMs, and we're able to say, these ones we're investigating.
Mhm.
These ones we knew are, we didn't put a not affected. We have too many products to do that. And
Right,
then I
right.
had a, a customer come to me later and say, well, you added a product to it after you released the first one. I said, yeah, because a third party dependency came back and told us they were affected. And
Right.
that's going to happen to
Mhm.
us until we get, to a better confidence layer. But from a team standpoint, modern pipelines, they're really, really, it's really easy for them
Yeah,
to
yeah.
actually create an
Right.
SBOM. Not a problem at all. They're able to do it like with a snap of their fingers or
Yeah,
a
because we were talking
flag.
about transient dependencies rather
Yeah.
like years ago, and there were solutions on the market that could help you
Yeah.
do that depending on your software stack.
Yes.
Of course, like you said, a more modern
Right.
stack that has the tooling to be
Yes.
able to handle that. But I like
Yeah.
Right.
the like some vendors, I hear CISOs talk about, well, I asked them and they're like, oh, I don't know, but I don't know if that has that vulnerability, or I don't know if there's going to be an SBOM for that, right? The answer can't be, I don't know. I like if the
Right.
answer is like, here's
Yeah.
what we have, and by the way, there might be stuff coming out later, and that's fine. Like as a CISO, I'm like, that's
Right.
fine. Let me know
Right.
as soon as you know, because we all just can't snap our fingers and have insight
No.
into every single thing and every different transient dependency.
Yeah.
But I will
And
say
when we
this.
get requests for SBOMs, people will apologize. They'll go, "But we're not running the latest version."
Mm,
And I'm
mhm.
like, "That's okay. If we're able to do what we can, if we have the binaries, we'll run it through a binary scanner and tell them, 'Hey, this is
Sure.
the best that we can do.'" Which they could have run it. Everybody has tools now
Yeah.
that can run and
Mhm.
scan and be able to find some open source and different kinds of things. And they're just appreciative, of, hey, we went to that, we did the best we could to be able to give that information. You had a question, Alan?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, you can lament that you had to add one on the second publication, right? Oh, we found this one that we didn't
Yeah.
know about, and it was a third party dependency, and maybe you had to go down your food chain to find out a
Right.
little more. But compared to Heartbleed, like Log4j versus Heartbleed, night and day what we're capable of now, night and day.
Yes.
My
Mhm.
first Heartbleed publication when I was in manufacturing, going to my customers was notice number one. I'm now going to go talk to every product team in my company and find out if we're vulnerable and which versions, if so, right?
Right.
Like I was starting with nothing back in those days, nothing.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's been huge progress for us. It's been huge progress, and I
Yeah.
think we have to keep that in mind that as an industry, we're really moving forward well. I think.
Yeah. And one of the things that is really important to me going forward is, and we talked about it a bit, is you've got end of life components. So I want to be able to better tag those in the future. So I've been talking to different people, because you've got not only the zombie open source, like it hasn't been updated in 24 months and things like that. Maybe it has no vulnerabilities and didn't need to be, or there's just no maintainer anymore. So there's a lot that we can do in regard to being able to understand. That's one of the reasons, as a developer, I always had my list of maintained, components. But as a project and an engineering manager, I never looked back at it because I didn't need to back in those days, right? I was just like, set it and forget it. I made sure I complied with the license and I was good and never had to touch it again.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have to go back. And of course, it's never really the same people, right? Because people change over time
Well, and the
generally.
companies
And
change too. I mean, I saw a commercial
they do.
component that through acquisition, and I'm like, well,
Yes.
that's essentially the same component, maybe a different variation of it, but it's still the same
Yes,
component. And
it
how do
is.
we identify it unless, like I think what you're saying, Cassie, we need to maintain the
Yeah.
catalog, the list, the
Yeah.
manifest, if you
Yes.
will, of
And
that.
the history of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's one of that project that I was talking about. Is it identified a joint venture we had like 15 years ago with one
Right.
of another company? It's like, why is it not have a Schneider on this? Why did this come up? And it turns out because of the joint venture, and that other company maintained basically the code base after that. We're using that original set of version or a branch of it, for per se. And so a lot of this provenance, and that's what I again gave my 2 cents for. So the CISA attestation form, the secure software
hmm
attestation form, used to say provide the provenance. And I pushed back. I'm like, I can't sign this. You're asking provenance based off of the NIST definition, says the chronology of all of this. Said, I can't give you that. I can't go back and invent history. And so they added to the greatest extent possible. And
Yeah.
that was because I'm
As a
like,
few.
if
Yeah.
I can't sign it and I'm at maturity level 4 of a secure development framework, nobody can sign this to say they have the
Right.
provenance, because
Right.
you can't go back and do provenance for every line of code.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
No, agreed. Alan, any more questions for Cassie?
I'm just floored. This has been a great conversation. The maturity and the discipline you're talking about here, the nuances and the subtleties, the getting on top of your own supply chain and incorporating those SBOMs into your SBOMs. I don't have a question. I just have a wow. I'm impressed. That's what I have.
Oh, it's
Thanks.
awesome.
It's still so far to go, but I I feel very honored to be working for a company that lets us really help drive the industry
Mhm.
to these pieces, both from a transparency, but also, what can we do to make things better? We're not, besides being in the ISA IEC 62443, a lot of these kind of areas, you only have a few companies like Cisco and some of the, a few others that are really trying, how do we make this better
Mhm.
for our overall product base at the device layer? And so, yeah, I'm really happy to be able to work on these kind of projects.
That's
Awesome.
too
Well, it
cool.
was great chatting with you today, Cassie. Thanks very much for your time
Yeah.
and sharing all your thoughts and insights on the show today. That will conclude Below the Surface for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.